This is a landscape painting based on a landscape photograph I found on a website called paintmyphoto.com, where artists are encouraged to post photographs, and also photographers are encouraged to post their photos, and artists are encouraged to use them as reference for paintings. I found this photograph of a stream flowing through the woods with some big, interesting looking trees covered in vines. So I thought I'd try a wet in wet approach to the beginning stages, and you see me here looking at the photograph and referring to it for just the initial impressions of the general colors. I'm trying to cover the surface with the initial lighter colors and generally where they are. At this point, the paper has dried to some degree, so I'm going ahead and continuing putting the major color areas, such here as the tree trunk, or tree trunks and branches. This is maybe a good time to emphasize the importance of good paint and good paper. The paper I'm using is a handmade paper from France called Arches. It's a 140-pound weight, which is a good thickness and strength. A good quality paper like Arches handmade paper is essential for this kind of good watercolors, good watercolor behavior on the paper. And the paper itself is very strong. You can put tape on the edges if you want, or put tape anywhere. And when it comes time to pull the tape off, it never tears the paper. The paper is so strong. You can scrape it. You can get it wet multiple times. It does not tear or flake or anything like that. And of course, it's archival, doesn't turn yellow over time. And a word about the actual paint that I'm using. You'll notice when you go to buy art supplies and you buy watercolor paint or any kind of paint that it comes in all different prices. And you think, well, what's the difference in quality? I mean, paint is paint, isn't it? The colors, I get the color I want. Shouldn't it work just fine? Well, the difference in higher quality, let's just talk about watercolor. Higher quality watercolor paint in tubes of paint, the more expensive paint is the more densely pigmented. In other words, there's more of a more pigment per filler material. The carrying material, that such as gum arabic, that mixes. I mean, the pigment itself is some kind of a powder from various locations, and it's you can find it naturally occurring in some cases. Sometimes it's chemically put together, but it's a pure pigment found in the earth and found in other places. I mean, found in chemical laboratories sometimes. but it is, you have to mix it with some kind of a liquid material so it can be squeezed out of a tube and mixed with water when we're painting with it. So the higher quality paint that you buy will have more pigment in it than filler material. It'll be a denser concentration of pigment, and so the paint itself, when you put it on the paper, will go farther. It'll be more vibrant. It'll be denser and more vibrant, and it will I don't know how to put it into words. I can't articulate it very well, as you can see, but it just looks better. So if you're able, stick with the better brands of art supplies. So I'm going ahead in the painting, putting down some of the darks. Just establishing the overall look of things to get a feel for how it's going. Referring to my reference photograph, but I'm not sticking too closely to it when I change a few things around as I look at the painting, look at what I have in my head as to how it's going to look when I finish. But I am taking a lot of cues from the actual source photograph. What I'm doing right there is putting leaves, simulating piles of leaves that have accumulated along the bank of the stream, and I'm using a kind of a graphic shorthand, simply moving my wrist in a kind of a random way to get leaves and grass. You see I did the same thing in the leaves up in the trees. I'm kind of flipping my wrist in a random motion. The closer, paying attention to how in the distance, such as right here, I'm doing some tall grass, and again I'm using a simulated flicking of my wrist to get the general effect, but not actually drawing every single blade of grass, but giving the feel of grass so that your eye will fill in the details. The dynamic between your eye and your brain will say, hey, that's grass, or hey, that's a clump of leaves on a tree. Turn the brush sideways to get more random marks. Simulate a distant field. One thing that attracted me to this scene was that those twisting branches of this tree, the massive trunks, going through. Watercolor always dries lighter than when you first put it down. Even though I've been painting watercolors for many years, you never quite totally can predict. So I find myself still, after all these years, going back over and over areas where I thought I had it dark enough, but I didn't quite have it dark enough because it keeps drying lighter and lighter. Okay, really getting into the detail here. Adding shadows underneath edges of things, hoping to achieve a simulation of reality under these clumps of ivy and clumps of other things wrapping around the trees, and trying to simulate the effect of rocks and big rocks and small rocks underneath the water. But again, back to my talk about art supplies. You think you're saving money when you buy cheap art supplies, but in the end, you're just frustrating yourself with things that don't behave the way you want them to behave, like cheap paper which buckles and tears, cheap paint that doesn't get the color you want, but is so diluted with filler material that it's just not bright and brilliant, and it just looks dull on the paper. And you squeeze out big amounts of it, and it still doesn't achieve the density that you'd like to have. So it, in the long run, it's better to go ahead and get good art materials when you can. Okay, here I am mixing up some gouache, which is a opaque watercolor, and adding some little details of different colored leaves around the base of the tree and other places. So really I don't have a whole set of gouache paint. I just have one big tube of white gouache, and you mix that with regular watercolor to get whatever color, opaque color you want. Another trick is to simply open a tube of transparent watercolor and get a big glob of say a bright red or something, and you can just put that right on the paper, and it'll be opaque itself without any addition to it. I see watercolorists do that when they're doing a city street painting, and they have cars on the road that they're painting, and they take a big dab of pure red paint right out of the tube to put the tail lights on the cars. I'm looking forward to doing that myself someday when I do a city street scene, which I haven't done. As far as I know, I may have never done that. I can't remember. I have drawn street scenes like out in the country along the interstate. Okay, here's the finished painting. And there it went.